All right, so I'll read the last paragraph again. Problem, said Mr. Larson. I didn't know there was any sort of problem. What problem are you talking about, Phil? Dr. Barnes leaned back in his chair and began gently swiveling from side to side, with his eyes staying steady on Mr. Larson's face. Are you familiar with a Supreme Court decision known as the Hazelwood case? Mr. Larson immediately replied, Hazelwood, of course. In 1988, the United States Supreme Court ruled that school principals have the legal right to say what does or does not get printed in school newspapers. It was not a unanimous decision, but 5 justices agreed that a school principal has this authority. Some people think the court's decision is a violation of the Constitution's guarantee of free speech. Others say that if the school is the publisher, the school gets to make the final decisions just like the owner of a newspaper would. Dr. Barnes was impressed. He had underestimated just how well-read and well-informed Mr. Larson was. Nodding, he said, You have a clear grasp of the case, I see. And tell me, Mr. Larson, do you agree with the court's decision? Mr. Larson smiled and said, That's kind of like asking if I agree with the law of gravity. Whether I agree with it or not, it's still the law. Dr. Barnes chuckled. True, quite true. The law is the law, and since it is, then I assume you will not mind if I review each new edition of this paper before it is distributed, correct? Mr. Larson kept smiling, but there was no smile in his voice. He said, If it was a school newspaper, I wouldn't mind that at all. But you see, Phil, it's not. The Landry News is a classroom newspaper. It's made by my students in room 145. And I have every confidence in their ability to decide what ought to be in it. Leaning forward so much that his stomach pressed against the desk, Dr. Barnes pointed at the newspaper. He said, If this is a classroom newspaper, all the copies should have stayed in your classroom, Mr. Larson. Mrs. Cormier found this copy on the floor all the way over in the 3rd grade hallway. You know, it's a funny thing about paper, said Mr. Larson. My wife and I once flew to New York City for a long weekend, and after we flew back to Chicago on Sunday night, we walked to our car, drove home, went inside, and then I sat down and put my feet up. And you know what? There was a piece of paper, an advertisement for a New York restaurant, stuck right onto the bottom of my shoe. Paper has a way of getting around, Phil. Dr. Barnes did not appreciate the humor in Mr. Larson's story. Frowning, he patted the paper on his desk. Do you know how many copies of this newspaper were printed? Mr. Larson shook his head. No, I can honestly say I do not know how many copies the kids made. I left that up to them. They are proud of their work, and they have a right to be. I'm sure they've shared some copies with their friends, probably carried them home to show their folks, too. 75 copies, said Dr. Barnes. According to Ms. Steinert, your students made 75 copies of this newspaper. You have 23 students in your afternoon class. So unless you are trying to tell me that each child kept 3 or more copies, then this is a school newspaper. This newspaper is produced here in my school using school computers and school paper and school printers and school electricity and school time.